I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson for the summer of Cosmere, where I am reading all of the Cosmere books in their published order. And so we just got done with all of Mistborn, so expect spoilers for that. Most of the Stormlight Archive is done, so look out for that. Elantris, Warbreaker, the short stories, just most of the stuff in the Cosmere. We're starting to get to the end here. And Tress of the Emerald Sea is a really interesting book because for the first time in the Cosmere books, we have an actual narrator in the person of Hoyd, who has, up until this point, kind of been a little bit of an Easter egg in each of the books. I've never really stopped to talk about Hoyd because, to be honest, I don't think that he is that important. And I know that that might be a weird thing to say for longtime fans of the Cosmere, but the fact is that he's never a major character, and that's kind of the point of him in a certain way. He's this trickster character who lives in the margins, and there's a certain kind of freedom to him. There's a certain feeling of the magician to him, that he's just a slippery character. And I think because of that, not much narrative weight or symbolic weight can rest on Hoyd because he's just too unstable to carry that weight. That's part of why I think we love him in the fandom. But he's one of those clues, that all of these books are connected. If you're not online and just reading these books in a vacuum, just kind of going through them, I can imagine in, 25, 30 years, when the whole thing has been done and gone and, all of the original fans, have gone on to do other things, then somebody just ripping through these books in a year or something like that, kind of like what I'm doing, would start to notice, oh, there's Hoyd. And, he's one of those connective tissues. But now he is the one telling us the story. And so every once in a while throughout the narrative, we get the first person of I, but keeping in with his character, he is not the protagonist of the story. He's, again, one of the peripheral characters. And I think this is part of what makes this book really interesting for me because it feels very postmodern in a certain sense. And so what I mean by that is that there's kind of a deconstruction that's happening, something very intentional about the way that the story is being told that is in dialogue with what is kind of quote unquote normal in the fantasy genre, what we're looking for in these kind of stories typically, and how it's getting played with in this story. So the first person narration is very typical now. Like in the last 15, 20 years, it's become the most popular way to have the narration of the book happen. But it's always the main character who is saying the I did this and I did that. And this story's main character is Tress. It's right there in the name. And she's a young woman. She's very much constructed to be the kind of main character that we're used to seeing in the last 15 to 20 years as a protagonist. And I think right up front, he plays with both Brandon Sanderson and Hoyd are playing with ideas of, tropes and anti-tropes that have been influencing fantasy fiction for the last 20 years. And so Tress identifies herself, or is identified, I guess, by Hoyd as a girl who, when she looks at all the other girls and how they are constantly characterizing themselves as, I'm not like other girls, that is a cliche and a trope in the fantasy genre these days, right? This is the kind of thing that people are avoiding now because it became so ubiquitous in the early 2000s. And so Tress kind of embraces the way in which she is just like a normal girl, or like she's like herself. And she's not anxious about that. She's okay with who she is. And so she's already being kind of written as an anti-trope intentionally. And she has this very simple romantic attraction to Charlie, the Duke's son. And they have a very, sweet introduction, a very innocent introduction to, their romantic connection to each other. And it feels very genuine. They understand and appreciate each other in a very authentic way that, again, kind of undermines the very fraught and very will they, won't they, or contentious kind of energy that happens in a lot of like YA genre, fantasy genre books. And I don't want to say like anything's wrong with that, but it definitely feels like the entire beginning of the story is constructed to be a kind of like anti-story to what is typical or cliched at this point in these kind of stories. So there's nothing about Tress where she's like, an assassin or a secret princess or, this a powerful sorceress or any of this kind of stuff. She's very intentionally like a provincial girl who has this hobby of collecting cups, and she is interested in this boy who is not edgy, who is not, like different or special or hot or whatever. He's just a boy and she's just a girl, and they fall into a very innocent first time kind of love. And then the two of them are separated, and she goes on a quest to rescue him. And there's a way that, that story is a classic story that is in touch with fairy tales. There's a lot of fairy tale touches in the story, but they are, again, kind of like borrowed trope-like elements from the fairy tales inserted into this very postmodern, self-aware, self-deconstructing story. Because Hoyd is constantly interrupting the narrative and introducing anachronistic elements to us as the reader. He's kind of saying to us like, oh, hey, do you think it's weird that her planet does this and that kind of thing? Well, maybe it's not weird. Maybe your planet is weird. Maybe you're the weird one. And kind of like addressing the audience directly in the book, which audience address is one of those kind of fourth wall breaking elements that's very postmodern. Having this self-aware element to the story where you're aware that you are telling a story and that you're aware of the tropes of the story that you are telling and the audience expectation to those tropes and on like that. Like it's very self-reflexive, but he keeps it light and funny in the way that it is self-reflexive. And I think there could be a temptation here. One of the early postmodern tricks with this kind of storytelling is to have the unreliable narrator, right? And who could be more unreliable than Hoyd, right? He's the quintessential trickster of the Cosmere, and so maybe he's lying to us about everything that he's saying. But I think Sanderson makes this really cool, fun choice that sweeps away that kind of worry or cliche in the story, because Hoyd is characterized as an idiot in the story, quite literally. He is in a very embarrassing state. He is cursed throughout the entire story and behaves in an absurd and embarrassing way. And so if he was lying to us, why would he lie in this way that shows him to be kind of an ass, right? In making Hoyd vulnerable in this very particular way throughout the story, I think one of the things it does, besides being comedy relief and being delightful and funny and all of this stuff, is that it unconsciously keeps us from questioning the veracity of the story we're being told. Is Hoyd an unreliable narrator? I don't think so. I think that he is changing things about, the quote unquote true account of what actually happened, but he's doing it in order to facilitate a better storytelling experience for us as the audience. And a lot of those things are self-consciously pointed out to us in the story where, he calls a bunch of the characters the Dougs, like, and so he just groups them all together as this kind of like weirdo group of people who, don't have proper names because of some kind of way that everybody's name eventually evolves into Doug in the Cosmere. Like, okay, that's a very funny idea, but it's also self-consciously telling us that, like, hey, I'm leaving lots of details out of the story because those details are not relevant to the dramatic action of the story, which is a thing that we know about storytelling anyway. But again, I think it serves to alleviate the chance of us questioning, is this a reliable or unreliable narrator situation? We just don't even think about it because, he's directly addressing us about the ways in which he's changing the story to begin with. And he has framed himself in a way where he's really absurd. Now, the big theme that's going on in this book, I think, is the difference between seeming and being. So Tress, when she's on her home island, seems to be this very mild-mannered, doesn't want to make waves, socially or draw attention to herself kind of a woman with these very simple interests of, collecting cups, spending time with Charlie. But then when, the love of her life leaves and she feels like she needs to rescue him from the evil sorceress, she stows away on a boat, disguises herself as a royal inspector, and then poses as a royal assassin, and eventually, becomes a master of spore magic, and then the captain of a ship, and rescues the boy, and, comes back and gives the boon of prosperity to her hometown. So it's not just that Tress goes on this amazing adventure and becomes all of these different things and goes through this arc. I think that you can't tell by looking at someone who they really are. And that's a big part of what's going on in the story. We already know Wit and Hoyd, from the Stormlight Archive, from all of the various Cosmere stories. And so when we see Hoyd, we're like, oh, I know that guy. And then he immediately behaves in a way that we don't expect him to behave at all. And the way that he seems to all of the other characters around him is not what he actually is. So there, again, is this gap between the signified and the signifier that I've been talking about through the entire Cosmere. Here's what I really like about this story, though, because it, in Elantris, when this theme was established, we had this energy about the signified and signifier that established that there are these materialistic and kind of hard limits in the Cosmere that have to do with things that we would consider to not be materialistic and hard in the real world. Things like morality, aesthetics, right and wrong, good and evil, that there is some kind of subjectivity, there is some kind of energy to those things that is cultural and has to do with a perspective and an experience, and that they're not necessarily encoded into the universe in the way that, like electromagnetism or gravity is. But in the Cosmere, it does seem like they are, and that they are related to language in the way that they are in Elantris. And language is, of course, the fundamental material of storytelling itself, because this is a book that we're reading. And so it is an experience that is constituted by language. Throughout the story, Hoyd is very self-conscious about the way that he's playing with language, the things that he's doing with language. He's pointing out to us constantly the linguistic choices that he's making, and the relationship in the Cosmere that language has had with this materialism of the aesthetic is transformed and kind of undermined or maybe evolved is a better way to say it in this story, I think. Or at least we're getting the particular perspective of how Hoyd sees signification in the Cosmere, and that might be relevant as well. Because we even went so far in Dawn Shard, right, to have this kind of command word that was so magically potent that it invaded the body, of Risen and became a part of her very being in a way that, like usually we see that with investiture and other kinds of magic. But this seems to be like a word that became a part of who she is. And so there's something about language in the Cosmere that is very powerful, very primal, and is tied to some of the most primal things in that universe. But in this story, language is very playful, it's very obscure, and the meaning of words can sometimes be the complete opposite of what they may appear to be. And that is related to the way in which people themselves cannot be understood according to how they first seem to be. Their being and their seeming are not aligned, and they might not ever actually be aligned. For example, Anne and Fort are not what they first appear to be. And who they are is not easily guessed by our first encounter with them. So Anne is a person who, she has very poor vision. She has a really hard time seeing, and nonetheless, she loves to shoot guns and shoot cannons and try to hit targets that are far away. She loves the thrill of marksmanship, but but she can't actually see the target. She's a terrible judge of distance. Fort is a character who is deaf, and therefore he is mute, but he has a tablet to help him communicate with everybody by writing on it, and then they can read what he says, and when they talk, he can read what they're saying. And so you might meet the deaf mute and expect them to not be interested in talking. But Fort is the greatest negotiator on the ship. He has a lot to say. He has a wonderful command of language. He's full of words. He has a very powerful and persuasive ability to get what he wants using language. And so none of these people can be judged by their first encounter or by the kind of superficial details that would otherwise, we would expect to foreclose who they are as a person or, shutter them from different opportunities or ways of being. They are calibrated by Brandon Sanderson to exactly be the opposite of those kind of expectations. They are ironically calibrated, right? Like Anne is a sharpshooter who can't see. Fort is the negotiator who can't hear. So what they would seem to be is not what they actually are. There's that gap between the seeming and the being, the signified and the signifier. And I listed all the different ways that Tress throughout the story changes roles and changes who she is. Charlie, of course, is cursed to become a rat. And so we get this fairy tale trope of the prince as animal or the prince transformed, and that the curse must be lifted, through the power of true love. So this is a tried and true element in fantasy storytelling going back for centuries and centuries across pretty much every culture on Earth. But I think Charlie's transformation is one of those ways that shows, that he is not what he appears to be. He's this mild-mannered boy when he's on the island, and then he heroically tries to keep Tress safe, but he's not able to do it. He's trapped by this curse to become he appears to be something that he isn't. He has to talk around the curse because the language of it necessitates an entire new array of signification and way of communicating. I'll get into that more in a second. And then he transforms, back into his human shape. And so there's a way in which Tress is going out there, in order to find Charlie, and she finds him right away, but she doesn't recognize him because she's not looking for him to be this thing, that is with her. And I like that they still have this emotional connection, though, and that she likes to spend time with him even when he's a rat. There's something really sweet about their relationship that I appreciate and is really nice in the story, and that it exists there even when Charlie is Huck. But the ultimate example of this comes in with Hoyd. So when we're talking about signifier and signified, we're talking about this French philosopher of linguistics who's kind of breaking down, it's like the beginning of postmodernism, really. He's breaking down how language operates at the word level and how the definition of words can slide over time, and that there's nothing that really can ever arrest the meaning of a word. And so you can take a word like plastic, for example, is one of the classic examples of this kind of thing, where in the ancient usage of that word, plastic means something that is really durable and flexible simultaneously, something that is not easily torn, ripped, or broken, but can be reshaped in many different ways. But then later, there's a material that, kind of has all of those properties intrinsically to it that's invented in the 20th century, and that they call it plastic, based on the ancient definition of that word. And now when somebody says plastic, we think of the material, and we no longer think of this list of properties and elements. And so that's a way in which the word plastic has fundamentally changed its signification, but the signifier, the word itself, plastic, hasn't changed. And so when we're talking about, can you clean up the plastic, we're talking about like a particular kind of bowl or a plate or something like that. But if you read, in old poetry, somebody uses the word plastic, they're talking about flexibility. And so what the same word is pointing at is a completely different thing. And so Derrida, points out the way that this works mechanically, according to his philosophical ideas with language. And it starts to, it's all about deconstruction. It starts to deconstruct our relationship with how we believe that language works, that every word has a fixed definition, and that those definitions are very precise, and that we can very clearly communicate with each other. That is what the utility of language is. It is to, to clearly transmit your ideas to another human being so that you are not misunderstood, right? And Derrida points out that misunderstanding is just built into the whole thing, that language is just automatically very ambiguous. It is automatically rife with misunderstanding, and that over a large enough time scale, a sentence that you write out now will mean something completely different in the future. And so when I talk about in Elantris that there is this materialism that has to do with language and the signifier and the signified, I feel like Sanderson was pushing back on this postmodern notion of deconstruction, that he was saying, no, there are things that are good and there are things that are bad, and those things are fixed. And there is a relationship between the fixedness of those things and language. There is a real way to talk about goodness and evil that is unchanging, is kind of the claim that I feel is put into place by Elantris and is elaborated upon by the first era of Mistborn and kind of messed with in Warbreaker, and on and on. I've been talking about it for this whole time. Now in this book, we're really getting into a kind of Derridian exploration that fully encompasses, it kind of takes what Derrida is saying and embraces it into the Cosmere system, because we have this curse that the sorceress has put onto Hoyd and Charlie. And one of the conditions of the curse is that they cannot disclose the details of the curse or how the curse can be reversed. And they know how to fix their problem, they just can't talk about it. So now there is a forbidden zone of communication. There's words that have been subtracted from the lexicon that are available to Hoyd and Charlie. And so when Tress communicates with Hoyd, trying to figure out where the sorceress's lair is, where on the map, what island is it, she's able to point to all of these various places, and then Hoyd will start talking. And the things that he says are nonsense, and they don't communicate anything meaningful to this question that Tress is asking him. And so all of the words, all of the signifiers that he is throwing out there of blah, 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 on this island, did you know this, and blah, 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 blah. The thing that they signify, the thing that they are pointing to is no, or silence, or that's the wrong place. And then when she points to one of the islands and he says nothing at all, the silence is actually the signifier of yes. The signification is that is the place. So the silence becomes the word, and the word is the silence. There's a complete inversion of the typical signifier-signified relationship, which validates Derrida's entire philosophical system of how language operates, how the words themselves can slide in meaning to become anything else. They're completely interchangeable in what they are signifying. And so silence itself, which would, usually that is a lack of information, that is no information, that is not even a part of speech, becomes the speech itself. And the speech is merely noise that signifies nothing. So I think that is brilliant. That whole thing is like a really fascinating development in this relationship that the Cosmere has to language. I think it furthermore demonstrates how language unifies people, how it brings people together. Because there's these ideas that language kind of severs us from our connection to other people because of the ambiguity, because of the problems in communication, because of the misunderstanding. It cuts us off from other people and causes us to get into these situations where we say one thing, but someone hears another thing, and then problems arise. That's exactly what's happening here between Tress and Hoyd. He is saying a thing, and she is hearing the no of it, and then he's not saying a thing, and she's hearing the yes of it. So ironically, the ambiguity and the way in which language misses what you're trying to say is the thing that facilitates the connection here. And you look at a character like Fort with his tablet and the languages, and how he is able to connect with other people through language, and how essential language is to connecting him. And the fact that Huck, as Huck the rat, can communicate with language and make a friendship with Tress when she doesn't know who he really is. And all of the curse itself is constructed out of language. It all has these conditional statements because the sorceress is an Elantrian. And so we know that Elantrian magic is literally made of language. It is language that kind of rewrites reality because of its close association with the very fundamental nature of the Cosmere itself. Because it is so closely tied to reality, to the actual signifiers that constitute reality, when the language rewrites elements of reality, reality responds to reconstitute itself to match the language. And so instead of being a denial of Derridian philosophy like it was in Elantris, now there's an embracing of the Derridian and showing how that fluidity of the language, which I think is symbolically represented in the story as the superfluid sea that the ship itself rides on, with these, what would otherwise be a mountain of inert material in the spores that fall from the moons. Instead, they work just like an ocean that roils would. Well, there's a roiling ocean of words and language as well that's constantly changing, and these characters are swimming in it. Hoyd is constructing a world for us out of these words that include all of these anachronisms that have nothing to do with the world that we're in, that are pointing out to us that we're reading a story, and he's breaking our immersion, and he's breaking the timeline of, the story and things like that. So just the level and playfulness of the language is engaging in this very postmodern usage and thought about, the tropes of the story, the language that it's using in itself, and the way in which language plays a role in constructing who we are as people and how we connect to each other as people. Because the language, has been used to curse Hoyd and make him into a fundamentally different kind of person. Huck the Rat is different than Charlie. And that is because of language. And when he changes back, that again is because of language. And so I think it shows how these sliding signifiers are not actually this kind of crisis problem of like, oh no, we're losing the meaning of our language. How will we be able to communicate? How will the people of the future be able to understand the past if the words mean something else later on? While that seems like a problem, what you're missing out on is the potential and the promise of, if we made the society today, then we can make the society tomorrow with the meaning making and the signification that we have made things now. That if language remade you into someone else today, then language can help you to remake yourself into someone else yet again tomorrow. The language being malleable and having all of this sliding meaning, in other words, is not a crisis. It is an opportunity. It is something that is full of potential. And so the sorceress thinks that she is won because she's perfectly constructed this verbal trap. And then instead, everything gets rewritten because Tress does the impossible, and she, rewrites who Hoyd is. She rewrites who Huck is by decoding the language, realigning the signifiers, like being able to read the silence, being able to read the noise, and thereby being able to undo the curse. So there is something fundamental. There's a kind of bedrock, just like on the planet, how you have this, sea of superfluid material. Underneath that, there are the rocks. There is the surface of the world. There is something real that is being signified by all of these sliding signifiers. There is something to read under there. You just have to decode it. But once you've gotten to that fundamental material, once you've done the work of decoding it and you understand it, now you can engage in the rewriting of it. Now you can author the experience in the way that Hoyd is authoring Tress's story. And I think it's really significant in the moment that Hoyd's curse is broken, he reaches into the gap and saves Tress from the sorceress, a kind of last minute deus ex machina, almost literally, because he becomes an Elantrian. So he's kind of elevated into this godhood state, right? And so he reaches in there and puts up a shield for her. And her response to him is not to read him as, oh my goodness, you are a secret god. You are, a secret savior of me. She instead asserts her command as the captain and says, mop up the floor, Hoyd, right? She treats him like the cabin boy. She gives him an order. And so linguistically, she recognizes, this is a very ironic moment. It's really delightful to me. She recognizes, that he's different, he's changed, he's someone new, but she keeps that signifier in the same place as the idiot cabin boy and continues to give him the orders. And so there's like a deep irony to that scene that speaks to their friendship, to their relationship, to the trust that they've built with each other. And it's just all there in just a few little words that are so ironically and delightfully spoken. And so by the end of the story, Charlie and Tress are different people. They've been changed by the experience of their adventure. And so the thing that signifies, when we say Tress, who are we talking about? What kind of woman is she? Is she fundamentally the same at the end of the story as she was at the beginning? I would say no. I would say that some things about her are the same and that some things about her are different, which means that she is a different woman at the end of the story. And so there's an evolution that's possible, a sliding of the signified, that people are paradoxes and that they are not able to be pinned down in this way where the language wants to kind of freeze everything into place. That's part of what the curse is, right? It changes Charlie into Huck and it changes Hoyd into the cabin boy. And both of those roles cannot be changed. They can't get out of those roles. They can't evolve and change as people. So their signification is trapped. That is what the curse is. It's a way of keeping them fixed in place. It is defining them literally. And so what a real person is an unfinished sentence. It is, the open ellipse. We are, as people, the signified thing that will slide in meaning right up until the moment of death. And even after we die, sometimes the meaning of who we were changes, even in our absence. And so while there is something there to talk about when we talk about who is Tress, who is Charlie, who is Hoyd, there's always the present moment, which is evolving and informing and changing the answer to, who are they? Who is that signified? While it is a concrete, real thing that we could talk about, it's not something that's necessarily permanent and always there forever and ever. So I think this is a really fascinating story because of the narration, because of its relationship to language and the importance of language in the entire Cosmere project up until this point. And I think that this is like a real turning point for the role of language in the Cosmere and pointing to what is possible, the importance of language as a bridge between people and as part of the tool set of what is going to allow us to reconstruct ourselves, to rebuild ourselves, and to change. Because that's just one of the things that Sanderson's just really, really interested in this bigger cosmic story. And so we're going to go to another Hoyd story after this with Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And that's going to be the next book in the Summer of Cosmere.